blessing us with this new day to gather together. Thank you for the encouragement we receive from one another. Thank you for the light which your word gives us. And we pray for your blessing as we study your word together this day. And we pray that your truth will shine clearly. And we ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen. Here in chapter 8, I wanted to start out by identifying three sort of major themes that Paul is going to address in this part of the letter. And those are the ideas of generosity and equality and then transparency. So as we go forward into the chapter, we'll see how those are played out. There are other ones that we, of course, could think about, but those are at least three that we can start with. And since I'm a teacher, then I want to start with a pop quiz. But I don't want you to be concerned because I'm confident that everyone will do well on this pop quiz. So we're just going to have three questions, so it won't be long. And you don't really need a pencil, even though that's what you see on the screen. So here's the first question. Who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, as that's expressed in Psalm 50, verse 10? Okay, and everybody said, God. And why is that? Because he made it. Everything, and later in that psalm it says, everything is mine. Everything that you see is mine. So God owns it all. Second one, this comes from Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 8. And who is it who graciously gives us all things? God. Same answer, right? All right. You're 2 for 2 so far. You're doing great. All right. Third question. How much will we take with us from this world when we die of the things that we see? How much, can you show me the universal symbol for how much we're going to take with us? Exactly. Everybody's got it exactly right. So everybody made an A+ on this quiz. What's that? Yes, but those are the things that are not tangible that we can touch and possessions and all of that, but we do take our souls. I've heard it said that the only two things that are eternal are our souls and the Word of God, because that's what the Word says. So that kind of gives us the idea of perspective on all of this when we think about what Paul is going to talk about in this next section. So we'll start with the first 5 verses in chapter 8. And now, brothers, we want you to know about the grace of God that the grace that God has given the Macedonian churches. After the most severe trial, their overflowing joy and their extreme poverty welled up in rich generosity. For I testify that they gave as much as they were able, and even beyond their ability. Entirely on their own, they urgently pleaded with us for the privilege of sharing in this service to the saints. And they did not do as we expected, but they gave themselves first to the Lord, and then to us, in keeping with God's will. So the idea of generosity, and to set the stage, some of this will kind of go back to Paul's first letter to the Corinthian church that we studied together back in the fall. So he's continuing this appeal to them to sort of complete this contribution that was solicited. At this time, and the book of Acts talks about this, back in Judea, where Jerusalem was located, there was a pretty severe famine that had struck, and so there was great need in that part of the world, and the Christians there were affected by that. And so then that presented the opportunity for the churches in Asia Minor and Greece and areas like that that had been planted or established by missionaries like Paul, then to contribute to help their needs while they were suffering. So that's kind of what was going on in terms of the history of this. But here's a question. When we think about generosity, just in a general sense, what is it that motivates people to be generous? Love. What else, Sarah? Concern for other people. Yeah. And, you know, for all of the bad news that we get constantly on, you know, various platforms, whether it's, you know, broadcast or anywhere else, when a crisis happens, when there is an earthquake, or when there's a hurricane, wherever this happens in the world, that's the point at which people will rise above their sort of own selfish interests, and that will bring out the best, many times, of what you know, what's in people. And as hard as those times are, those times of crisis are also the time where some of the light and some goodness can kind of shine through. And it is really motivated by concern for others, and even people who don't know Christ. That's part of, you know, our common humanity, as people call it, or sometimes it's described as common grace. That's a part of what God has put into every person, that they can be concerned about other people. Now, obviously, are there times when a crisis happens and people take advantage of it? Yes, that happens too. So what's really inside people is what will come out in those particular times. But generosity is that thing where we realize that, you know, I can try to hold on to this, but you know, the need of another person is really greater in this case. And it's the kind of thing that we try to teach our children, right? From an early age, and that we have to remind ourselves of. So Paul continues. So we urge Titus, just as he had earlier made a beginning, to bring also to completion this act of grace on your part. But since you excel in everything, in faith, in speech, in knowledge, in complete earnestness, and in the love we have kindled in you, see that you also excel in this grace of giving. I am not commanding you, but I want to test the sincerity of your love by comparing it with the earnestness of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though he was rich, yet for your sake he became poor, so that you, through his poverty, might become rich. Titus is referred to here as he has been earlier in the letter, because he had occasion to visit Corinth while Paul was in Ephesus, and would send reports to him, because since Paul couldn't be there with the church in Corinth, but he was still concerned about them, he wanted to know how things were going. And apparently, from what we can gather, is Titus had a pretty special relationship with this church there in Corinth, though, you know, we can pick up on the fact from the Corinthian letters that the relationship that Paul had with the church was a little bit difficult, because Paul had to come down on them and sort of take them to task and try to bring some corrective discipline to what they were doing. Titus was able in another role to go in and work with them, but then also report back to Paul and let him know what was going on. So in this particular case, the appeal had been made earlier for them to contribute, and Titus was going to Corinth to kind of help bring that along, and they were traveling around to various churches to solicit their contribution in this. And notice this, that Paul says, "I'm not commanding you." He's not saying you have to do this, and he's also not saying you have to give this much money. He's appealing, to the best motives of generosity, and he's complimenting them. You have all of these things going for you: your knowledge, your faith, the fact that they had, when he had said they needed to address problems there, they had responded and they had tried to do that. And then he's talking about comparison, and he's talking about two different models that he wants them to look at. When we think about the ultimate example for us, who is the ultimate example in everything that we undertake in life? It's always Jesus, right? No one did what Jesus did for the world. No one gave up as much as Jesus did. Jesus did for us and for the world what only God could do, in giving himself and sacrificing himself and then being raised from the dead. So Paul appeals to that example of Jesus. And the idea of grace comes through here many times. The idea of giving is really important. Obviously throughout the New Testament, but certainly in this particular section. So, Paul is saying there are two examples that I want you to be inspired by. First of all, by the example of Christ, what Christ has done for us, but also by what he alluded to earlier on is the Macedonian churches. He talks about the fact that they are in extreme poverty. Corinth was a very wealthy city because of their location there as that port city. There was a lot of money that came through there, and of course, when there's a lot of money, there's a lot of pride. There's a lot of feeling of self-sufficiency. But the churches in Macedonia, that is Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, those churches in particular that are north of Athens, when we read back through the book of Acts and we see the conditions in which those were founded, those Christians went through tough times, and Paul went through tough times, as he was making his way down to Corinth. And so they didn't have a lot in terms of their means, but yet, in spite of the fact that they didn't have a lot, they wanted to give and contribute to the needs of the Christians back in Judea. And this is really what is interesting about this world, is that many times the people who don't have a lot in terms of material blessings are very often the most generous. And that's not a universal thing. That's not always true. But many times it is. I had heard this a few years ago, and I kind of had to go back and check on it, but I remember hearing that of the 50 states in the United States, at one time, by some statistic, the most generous state per capita was Mississippi. Now, Mississippi doesn't usually make it to the top of lists of, all of the great things, because they take a lot of kidding and, but when you think about it, it's not a wealthy state in comparison to other states in our country, but yet that there's an impulse for generosity and to try to help other people. And that has continued. There are other states that are also generous, and Mississippi's not always the number one in terms of statistics. But consistently, the people there give. And most recently, they gave to help the people in Ukraine with their situation. And so, they're very much like these Macedonian churches. They want to give to others. There's a story that I came across the other day, and I couldn't go back and find the source. But, we are familiar, of course, with Mother Teresa and the work that she did in Calcutta, India, working among the poorest of people. In the story, someone came to her and said, there is a woman who, lives here in this neighborhood. She's a widow, and she has 8 children, and they have no food. And so Mother Teresa got some rice, from what they had there, and she took it to this woman, and she said that these 8 children, she could tell that they were desperately hungry. It was really going to be a matter of survival. But she gave the rice to the woman, and the first thing the woman did was she took that rice and she divided it in half, and then she said, I'll be right back. She was gone for a while, and then she came back, and Mother Teresa said, what are you doing? I brought this for you. And she said, yes. She said, but I have a neighbor, and they are also hungry. So despite the fact that she had really significant needs there, she was thinking of someone else. So those are the kind of examples, again, that relate to what Paul is talking about here. So continuing in verse 10, and here is my judgment about what is best for you in this matter. Last year you were the first not only to give, but also to have the desire to do so. Now finish the work, so that your eager willingness to do it may be matched by your completion of it, according to your means. For if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable according to what one has, not according to what one does not have. Again, he's not specifying an amount that should be given. But he's saying, you had expressed this desire previously to contribute to this project, and now it's time to fulfill your pledge. We might think of it in those terms, but to bring it to completion. In the Old Testament law, what is our understanding of how much someone was to give of their income? Okay, say again. A tenth, or it might be I heard somebody say the first fruits, the first of the harvest, but also the firstborn of your flocks and all of that. And there were different ways to address that. And of course, as we see that, part of that was the means to help to support the priests, that were engaged in full-time ministry. But it's interesting when you really go and you start looking at that. The 10th is just sort of the start, but then there are also other times where you are to give a little bit more, due to a particular festival or something else. And so that 10% was sort of the baseline, but a lot of times it could be higher than that. Now, let me ask you this. To the best of our knowledge, did the Israelites always, do that? And did they always give 10% and everything was... it talks about the 10th, and of course we're familiar with the word tithe, as that particular term. But that is specified in the law. You are to give a tenth of this, to support the priesthood. So that's where that comes from, is actually in the Old Testament law. But when you start reading through the Old Testament, the books of history, there were times when the Israelites gave, they contributed, they were generous, but not consistently. Because there were also times when they came back from when they came back specifically from the Babylonian captivity, and you had Nehemiah and others in the very last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, where he says, you're withholding what you're supposed to do to to support the priests and to keep the temple going. And so the prophets had to take him to task on that. So even for those people, they didn't always give that 10%. That's what they were told to do, but just because they were told to do, that didn't mean they did it. Unlike us, of course, right? Because we always do exactly what we're supposed to do, except I certainly don't. But Paul says, again, if the willingness is there, the gift is acceptable. It doesn't have to be this set amount. When we think about in the church, our understanding of how much a person is to give of their means to support God's work, what is the verse that comes to mind? God loves a cheerful giver. That's the principle. It doesn't say, we're not going to read in the New Testament, give 10%. That can be a good guide, but it's not commanded. But God says, whatever you give, I want it to be what you're willing to give. I want it to be willingness, out of love, not out of compulsion. And so I think that's really important for us. Not everybody is able to give a particular amount. Some people can give more, some less. But that cheerfulness, that willingness that comes from the heart, that motivates generosity, is really what God is seeking, because He wants it to be based on love for others and also our love for Him. Charles. And who said that? Who said, give and it shall be given to you? Charles? I think that was Jesus, wasn't it? Now, when we hear give and it shall be given to you, should we think, if I give, I'm automatically going to get something from God? I'm going to get that amount? No. But what we get back from God is much more precious. But there are stories, there are occasions, and maybe in your own lives, where you gave something sacrificially, maybe to someone, or maybe to the kingdom, maybe to God's work, and something came back to you unexpectedly, and that was God saying, here. But it's not a guarantee. It's not, what sometimes we will hear taught in different places is, if you tithe, if you give this, then you're going to get all, God is going to give you that new car and that house, and that's not, that mindset is not biblical. That is a worldly mindset. Right. That's an important point, Peggy. Thank you for that reminder. We're talking about money here because that's what Paul is talking about, but giving of ourselves, and as Paul said about the Macedonians, they gave themselves first to the Lord. But when we give of our time to other people, to God's work, the blessing that we get from that is just, it's rich and it's infinite, because we can never outgive God. Good point. Sarah says the return usually comes when you most need it. And I can think of a story that I heard recently. This woman was talking about she and her mother, single mother, were very desperate, and they had gotten, she had gotten a bonus from her job, and they were going to use that to buy Christmas presents. And so she was excited. They went to church. A missionary came through and said, "We're trying to do this project of translating the Bible into the language for these people." And her mother took that $100 and put it in the collection plate. And the daughter was like, "What are you doing?" And she said she was angry with her mother for doing that. They went home, and out of the blue, the church brought them, because the church knew, that they had needs, brought them food, groceries, brought them, gift cards that they could use at stores that was way beyond that $100. And it came right at that point of need. So Paul is now going to talk about equality. Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need, so that in turn, their plenty will supply what you need. The goal is equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Well, that reference that he's citing there is from the book of Exodus, and we remember the story of the manna coming down. And Moses said, "Okay, take this, it's an omer. I don't know how much an omer is, but it's a set amount, and go out and gather an omer's worth of this manna for every person that's, in your family. So gather that much." And every day they would go out and they would gather the manna. And, it came to the point where God was providing for their need, and they had as much as they needed. Now, do we remember about the story about what happened if they gathered more than they needed and tried to save it for the next day? It would rot. There was the one exception to that was on what we say Friday, on the sixth day, they would gather more so that they didn't have to go out and gather on the Sabbath, because it wasn't going to be there on the Sabbath. But this idea of providing just enough. And when we think about equality, that concept is really important, to our country. But how do people define equality? Are there different ways, or are there different things that they mean about that? What does equality mean in our country? All people are created equal, right? Nobody's better than another person, and that was central to kind of the founding of our country, which was kind of radical, because really that's not the way the world operates. So we can use equality in a different sense, and we recognize that, we strive for equality, but we don't always get there. In this particular case, when Paul speaks of equality of supplying needs, he's saying that if you want to even things out, here they have a great need. You're able to fulfill that need. Other times, things are going to turn around and they're going to be able to help you out. We see that, in society, when one area of the country is hit hard by a natural disaster, a lot of aid will flow that direction. But then, there are fires in California, and people will try to help with that. There's a hurricane in Florida, then maybe some of the people in California who've had a chance to recover from that can go help with the hurricane. So we recognize that we want to make sure that people have what they need, and we're able to do that if we're able to supply those particular needs exactly when they come. So Paul continues, "Thanks be to God, who put into the heart of Titus The same concern that I have for you. For Titus not only welcomed our appeal, but he is coming to you with much enthusiasm and on his own initiative. And we are sending along with him the brother who is praised by all the churches for his service to the gospel. What is more, he was chosen by the churches to accompany us as we carry the offering, which we administer in order to honor the Lord himself and to show our eagerness to help. We want to avoid any criticism of the way we administer this liberal gift. So again, Titus has this very special relationship with the Corinthian church, and he is trusted. Paul doesn't specify who this other brother is that's going to accompany Titus, but the idea is Titus is coming, someone is coming with him, and they're both attested to. Titus, they know. This other guy, they presumably have never met before. But the idea is we want to do things in a way that is above board because we want to be clear about the way we are doing this. For if we are taking pains to do what is right, not only in the eyes of the Lord, but also in the eyes of man. In addition, we are sending with them our brother, who has often proved to us in many ways that he is zealous, and now even more so because of his great confidence in you. As for Titus, he is my partner and my co-worker among you. As for our brothers, they are representatives of the churches and an honor to Christ. Therefore, show these men the proof of your love and the reason for our pride in you, so that the churches can see it. So there's actually going to be 3 men who are going to be coming to Corinth to take up this collection that then will eventually be taken to Jerusalem. And in the book of Acts, we're able to read where Paul is with this group, and they take the offering and they take it to the church in Jerusalem so that it can be distributed to help the people at that time of need. So 3 men are going to be involved in this. And here's the idea of transparency. We recognize that transparency is really important in the way we conduct our lives. And so what areas should we think about being transparent in the way we speak to others and the way we act toward others? When you think of places where you want people to be transparent, where's an example of where you want people to be transparent about how they're doing things? Work. Yeah. And it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be, you're supposed to understand how the processes work and everything. So work is an important one. What's another one? What about in our families? Honest communication, things like that. Doesn't mean it's easy, but it's important. Why is this important? Why is it important that we be transparent as Christians? Exactly. We're not just representing ourselves. We represent Jesus to those around us. And so, as much as possible, our lives need to be open. Now, transparency isn't the same thing as, some people think that if you just say things unfiltered and, just the first thing that comes to your mind, you're being transparent. But that's not really transparency. But it's being open about those areas in which you need to be open. I don't think any of us would want to live in a glass house. But we can also think about times in our lives where there was supposed to be transparency and there wasn't. Right? And many times that could have been in a work situation. That is, of course, an area in which we're always trying to get information about things that are going on in the world in which we live, from news sources and checking things out and talking to people. And that sense of transparency, that there's not some sort of hidden agenda, is something that we really want. But I think it's important too, as our sister said, that we model that for people because of the fact that we represent Christ. So Paul is concerned about this in regard to this collection. Why would that be important? You got a big collection coming from all these churches, and they say, we're going to take this to Jerusalem. How are you going to know that it's really going to go there? Because we see lots of examples in our world of people that were, supposedly collecting funds for one purpose, only to find out it isn't. And so the way that we conduct our financial affairs, but certainly in regard to the work of the church, we need to do that in as open a way as we possibly can. I think about, one of the extra projects that we have going on now is this Faith Roots Fund. And I appreciate the fact that when the appeal was made to the congregation, it said, this is what we want to do, here's why, this is how much it will cost. And this is, we can fund this based on things we've already set aside, but we need a little extra to help us reach this particular goal. And, we recognize that when it comes to developing things, especially for our youth and for our children, that's a really good thing. But we didn't have a fundraising campaign. We didn't have somebody come in from the outside and, sign pledges and all of that. There's nothing wrong with that if that's the way you want to approach it. But it's very much a grassroots, it's a roots effort that says, here's what we want to do and here's why. We're not going to take away from the work the church is already doing, but we have this opportunity to help to further develop what we're doing here at Red Bank, and here's why. And I appreciate the way that has been done, and the fact that there is that level of transparency, and the fact that we have, as Peggy alluded to, we have a lot of people giving a lot of time in terms of doing a lot of the labor and materials and things like that to help make this possible. So that's just one example. So Paul wanted to address this because he wanted the Corinthian church to understand that if you give to this effort, we're going to make every effort that we can to let you know that we're being honest and open and above board. And that was important because a whole lot of this letter is based on his having to defend his character. So this is a way for him to try to address any particular concerns they have about that. I want to thank you for your attention this morning, and that will close our class.